into the meet before we meet, before we start going through the formal presentation. So I'll stop sharing, Allison, if you're ready. We did send out a little questionnaire prior to today's call and to the working group members.
Coming right up. We weren't sure. There's 50 people thus far. So what we are going to, the question from the room was, are we going to do introductions of every single person? We are not. However, here in the room, we actually have everybody in their groupings, and we will have some chance there. And then one of the things I really want to do is I'm going to send everybody an email of the list we have thus far of who has joined. So you can tell me who am I missing, so we can make sure that they get the video from this. But there are 96 people that are on this, serving across the 7 chapters. And I just shared my screen and jumped ahead of myself. Absolutely. Yeah, when anybody does speak, they can definitely share their name, where they're from, and that's a great idea. Thank you, Miss Anna. I'm going to attempt to go into slide mode. Sometimes things disappear. Good. All right, homework. I will give you more notice next time. We had 18%, 18 responses, 19%. But what was really cool, and as you'll see, the actual ideas that were already flowing from those 18 responses were great. The good news is it's also a pretty good representation. I'm going to give major shouts out to Health and Social and Environmental for weighing in already. You guys were the highest. Housing and Shelter and Infrastructure and Transportation were the smallest reporting back. 83% had already seen the video, and the other 16 said, we will by this morning. Nobody said no. And then we didn't. So the good news, and if you saw in the video, we have a very exhaustive data set thus far, because we went through a vulnerability assessment already, and you'll see some of that when they talk about the project and where we've gotten to. But one of the things that that was a really good recommendation, Monroe County is going through a natural areas assessment, so they've got a much more in-depth piece data set for the natural areas environmental section. Question 5 were initial goals. As with most word art crowds, the things that came up more than once get a little bit bigger. With a sample size of 18, that means nature-based solutions got 3. But it was really, we have a really good mix of thoughts out there, and I could only reduce it to 2 or 3 words, so I may not have grabbed everything, but we have your responses, and I really hope everybody else gets a chance to start weighing in. And then we talked about what projects, programs, or policies might come out of that. And education was huge across the board, and just shade, but also a lot of other really great ideas. A readiness census, a critical workers plan were some really interesting ones that came out of those questions. And then lastly, my favorite that came out of funding opportunities was no, I don't know, but I'm going to start paying attention. There was actually 2 or 3 different people that said that. So there is our homework thus far. You are encouraged to go back and do that, even though it's after. There's a handful of folks. Oh, I should have done this. There's a handful of folks who could not be here at this exact moment in time. Apparently it's lobster season. But this whole thing is being recorded. So also, if there's anybody you want to share this with, any greater group that you're a part with, please do. We'll let you know when it's posted. Oh, this is the thing I forgot to do when we got to the sections. I'm going to change the view. Lies. It's because I'm still sharing. Jason, can you change the, oh, they're good. If you can share your video for this small second. I want to go ahead and do a show of hands of who's here from each section. Here in the room, we've got you divided up by our chapters. So let's start with infrastructure and transportation. There goes. That's your two as well.
You raise a hand.
So that's actually a really good question. We know that there's some overlap, and we know that some people are very specific and some people are very broad in their things. We don't expect you to show up at every single meeting for every single thing, but there will be one of our phases in the future will be a grouping of likes. So there might be 2 or 3 working chapters that come together to share where they're at. We can also share any ideas back and forth in the interim between meetings. Also, in the end, because we know there's going to be overlap, and because one idea from infrastructure may affect another idea for another group, one of the biggest, most important things is Tetra Tech is going to take all of these suggestions. They're going to be a ranked prioritization through you guys and then public as well, through cost effectiveness, thinking about short-term needs versus long-term predictions. And then we will have a 10-year plan of projects across all 7 chapters. So yes, I would like everybody to be as involved as possible, but we also recognize that that might be hard given your work schedules. But we'll have multiple times to revisit, and if there might be somebody else you'd like to send in your stead, specifically to another working group, please do. Let me know, send me an email, and we'll add them to the other group. So we did infrastructure and transportation. How about health and social? Here in the room, online. Then we have historical and cultural preservation. 3 in the room, handful online. Power and water. We got 1 in the room, actually, and we gave you Sheetal too. A couple online. Economic recovery. Good showing in the back. Housing and shelter. Awesome. I'm glad you guys are here. And environmental preservation. We got 1 here in the back and hopefully a handful online. That is it for me. I'm very excited for all of you who have turned out for our kickoff. Don't forget, those of you here in the room, there's coffee and donuts in the back and fruit. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Georgia and let her take it from here.
Thanks, Allison. Yes, we are all very excited to have so much participation, and we really look forward to your input and feedback throughout this process. As Allison mentioned, we did do a vulnerability assessment that really focused on flooding impacts throughout the city. And so this adaptation plan is going to expand the evaluation of the risks and hazards associated with climate change, and it's going to expand upon the different variable portions of the community and the effects of those threats, and how we can all as a group come together and identify ways to manage and mitigate those risks. So I'm going to start with a project overview, which also will include a brief touch on our project schedule. And then each of the chapter leads will go through their chapters and kind of highlight the purpose and intent of those chapters. We'll talk about equity and how equity is going to be incorporated into all chapters. And then lastly, we're going to talk about policy and implementation of this plan and how we, prepare something that doesn't just sit on a shelf. It's something that's actionable and will be implemented in order to make the city more resilient in the future. So as I mentioned, we've drafted our climate vulnerability assessment. We had several public meetings, got input from the citizens and other stakeholders throughout the process. We identified critical assets at risk due to different flooding scenarios and projected into the future into to 2040 and 2070. So the results of that vulnerability assessment are shareable, and our flood maps and critical asset maps are located on the adaptation plan, keywestadaptationplan.com website. So that was kind of the first step that we've taken, and now we're moving to the adaptation plan. So we've identified vulnerabilities specific to flooding in the vulnerability assessment, and now we're looking to identify projects on a broader focus, on broader focuses, and looking to develop an adaptation plan to combat those other climate risks. So we have 7 focus areas, which you all are a part of. We've identified working groups to help support the development of each one of those chapters. You all are the subject matter experts, so we look forward to your input and your feedback as we develop this plan. We're going to identify adaptation measures across all 7 focus areas or chapters, and those adaptation measures could be projects, could be policies, could be plans, different opportunities to for adaptation there. Once we have our list of projects for implementation, we will develop a way to rank and prioritize those projects. The adaptation plan is also going to include a funding analysis. As I'm sure everyone is aware, funding these projects can be costly. And so we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of state, federal, and local funding opportunities for each one of the projects or plans. And we want to make sure also that these projects are cost effective. We'll be developing for each of the chapters some policy recommendations and how policy updates and changes could provide more protective measures in the future. And then, as Allison mentioned, we're looking to develop an adaptation plan that focuses on the near term, the next 10 years, and what we can do to ensure a more resilient community. Meanwhile, we'll be projecting out other actions that can happen between now and 2070, so around the next 50 years, and then beyond the 50-year mark. Again, through this process, we will be engaging the public and other stakeholders, and we hope that you will help encourage other members of the community to engage in those public activities. So, high level, the adaptation plan will develop a list of comprehensive strategies that includes structural adaptation strategies and non-structural. They'll be regional and community scale, and we will prioritize these strategies for implementation over the next 10 years. So if you didn't catch it on Allison's round robin there in the room, we have 7 chapters. We have the infrastructure adaptation plan, the environmental adaptation plan, historic and cultural adaptation plan, power water adaptation plan, the economics adaptation chapter, and housing and shelter adaptation, along with health and social adaptation. And so, as you can see, each adaptation chapter has a chapter lead, and we'll be hearing from these chapter leads today. So the intent is to develop equitable adaptation strategies across the 7 chapters, identify projects, policies, and plans for the chapter. We'll be performing a cost-benefit analysis for these projects, policies, and plans. And for projects, we'll be developing planning level cost estimates for infrastructure. Again, we'll be looking for funding opportunities in order to offset some of the costs for these projects, and we'll prioritize them over all chapters to develop the 10-year plan. Through the vulnerability assessment, we really focused on the asset classes that are required by the Resilient Florida program. That includes transportation, critical infrastructure, critical community and emergency facilities, and natural, cultural, and historic resources. And as I mentioned, we'll be expanding that to the different focus areas for the adaptation chapters. I've kind of lumped infrastructure, power, and water in this first slide. We'll be identifying the critical assets at risk. We're reviewing the ones that were identified in the vulnerability assessment. We plan to identify projects that will reduce structural vulnerabilities. That includes hardening, elevating, or physically adapting the structures to reduce or eliminate flood risk. And again, we'll look at cost benefit, which is, is it worth the cost versus the level of service we'll get from that project. The environmental chapter will identify assets at risk along the coastline and shifts in habitat. We'll look at greenways and drainage feature opportunities, coral seagrass and mangrove restoration, tree canopy and preservation of natural areas, and nature-based solutions for shoreline protection. I think a lot of these elements were identified by the working group members in their responses to our homework. So the historic and cultural adaptation chapter, obviously we recognize that the city of Key West has a very robust historic and historic nature. So we'll be looking at elevating buildings, wet or dry floodproofing of buildings, potential relocation, stormwater management improvements, or simply just ensuring that we have a solid recording or record of the historic property through documentation. The economic chapter will look at risks to business, tourism, ports, and government agencies, and develop strategies based on future challenges and opportunities, identify opportunities. We'll evaluating adjusting financial strategies and policies and transitioning the city to more sustainable practices. The overall intent is to ensure that we mitigate economic risks for the community. And the health, housing, and equity chapter will look at affordable housing, retirees, the working class, identify strategies to stabilize rents or premiums, look at the health and the risks to health and human services, such as exposure to extreme heat, and ensure that we are considering equity through all of these strategies. So this is kind of our roadmap for the project, which started off with collecting the background data. Again, we've had a couple of public workshops. We evaluated the climate hazards and risks specific to flooding. We looked at all the critical assets within the city that are owned and maintained by the city, and looked at the risk of those assets to the different flood scenarios. We did identify some adaptation strategies included in the vulnerability assessment, and developed the required report, maps, and tables that are being submitted to the State of Florida Department of Environmental Protection for the grant. We identified hotspots throughout the city. We prioritized the project. We ranked them. We did an exercise where we identified whether an asset class was a low priority, a medium priority, or a high priority in order to prioritize the projects, and have a list of projects that will be submitted to the state of Florida, to DEP, in order to qualify for future funding opportunities through the Resilient Florida program. So here we are, 9, 10, 11, 12, working on mitigating the vulnerability to flooding and other climate risks, the cost benefit analysis, looking at funding sources, and developing the adaptation plan for 10 years. So why are you all here? I think it's important to understand the working group purpose. We really want to make sure that we have a robust data set. We've looked at publicly available data. We've coordinated with the GIS section of the city's team, and we recognize that there may be other data sets that are applicable to each chapter that we haven't identified or pulled into our data set. So we are looking for collection of other data sources. They can be reports or GIS data or other things, types of data that you think would be applicable and help support the development of the adaptation chapter. We really want to hear from you about adaptation goals and strategies and how to ensure that we're meeting the goals of the city. And then we'll also be looking to you to help with the prioritization criteria. What means the most to you? What's most important to you? We also will be looking for your help with the feasibility of the implementation and the cost benefit ratio, et cetera. Again, as Allison mentioned, we're looking to identify funding strategies for all of the implementation of these projects in the form of grants or taxing districts or involving loans or insurance tools, things that you all may be aware of that we are not. We really do a good job at looking at state, local, and federal grant opportunities, but recognize that there are other funding mechanisms that can be implemented for these projects. So as we get closer to the end, you'll help us review and approve the prioritized project list, the policies, the funding options, and the 10-year implementation schedule. We'll have you review our chapter text, charts, and tables for the adaptation plan, and then review the public workshop and city commission presentations to ensure that we have accurate and detailed information to share with the community. As Allison mentioned, we're going to have a few future working group chapter meetings, and we will be lumping them together to kind of streamline the overarching themes of these chapters. So we are envisioning 3 meetings: a pre-draft of the prioritized project list, pre-public workshop with a presentation review, and then a draft adaptation plan review. And the groupings are infrastructure with power and water, housing, shelter with health and social chapter and the economics chapter, and then historic and cultural and environmental chapters. And the adaptation plan itself, we're looking to have a draft in February 2025 with a public workshop, and then finalizing that plan by August of 2025. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we track implementation of these projects through time. So it's a real implementation strategy for adaptation. So with that, I'll take a little bit of a pause and see if anyone has any major questions or thoughts prior to diving into the chapter overviews. I'm looking to see if anybody's raising their hand or has a comment in the chat.
The PowerPoint will be available as well as a recording of this meeting.
Yes.
Everybody looks happy in this room.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Allison. All right. So I am going to hand it off to my friend Evan first. He's calling in early this morning. He's on the West Coast. not of Florida, of the US, calling in early this morning. So Evan, please introduce yourself and then take it away.
Hey everyone, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm Evan Rushrider and I'm on the civil infrastructure team with Tetra Tech. All right, so for buildings within the infrastructure chapter, we are specifically concerned with critical city-owned assets such as schools, fire rescue stations, police stations, community centers, and buildings designated as emergency relief shelters, among other critical assets. Typical building adaptation strategy would be providing dry flood proofing by means of flood doors and or flood barriers at building openings. Strengthening existing building structures to resist flood loads is required, and elevating important electrical equipment above the flood elevation. For marinas and port adaptations, we can consider elevating access such as parking lots and walkways, increasing the capacity of dolphins and gangways to handle floodwaters. For seawalls, Tetra Tech has already successfully provided multiple seawall designs around the city of Key West, so we would consider using similar designs there. And for green infrastructure adaptations, we would consider incorporating features like green roofs, rain gardens, bioswales, and sacrificial dunes. Green roofs can help manage stormwater by absorbing rainwater, reducing runoff, while providing insulation, which helps reduce energy building costs. Rain gardens and bioswales function similarly, but without providing any building benefits, obviously. And sacrificial dunes function essentially as berms along beachfronts and blend into the landscape well. For transportation, road, and bridge adaptations, we would consider regrading roads to higher elevations and or increasing the crown of roads for improved stormwater management. Another adaptation could be adding swales on the sides of roads where adequate right-of-way exists. To improve bridge flood resiliency, we would want to analyze the existing superstructures and substructures of bridges for strength and stability to withstand flood loads. At the Key West Airport, an adaptation strategy could be to provide dry flood proofing measures such as flood barriers, reinforcing the existing structure for flood loads, and elevating critical electrical equipment above the flood elevation, as well as providing stormwater drainage and storage around the perimeter of runways and roads that provide emergency egress. Emergency facility and shelter adaptations could be dry flood proofing, similar to other critical buildings. All right, we can go to the next slide. Thanks. In general, we should consider wet flood proofing where dry flood proofing cannot be provided practically or economically. And to clarify, wet flood proofing measures allow floodwaters to enter structures, but without causing significant structural damage or to architectural finishes and things like that. Wet flood proofing is a good option where the existing structure is determined to be inadequate for resisting hydrostatic flood loads. For coastal revetment and shoreline stabilization, we should consider seawalls as previously discussed, or sacrificial sand dunes, which would be a more nature-based solution. Roadway elevation is an important adaptation strategy for transportation infrastructure. And outfall improvement adaptations can help tailwater conditions at transportation infrastructure as well. Finally, safe room construction is an adaptation strategy that could involve providing a dry flood-proof room inside of a building that is otherwise wet flood-proofed. And for the infrastructure chapter goal examples here, achieving a neighborhood scale adaptation could involve providing seawalls completely surrounding a critical neighborhood and providing pumps for removing rainwater and rising groundwater. And an evacuation route or major corridor improvement could be similar to other transportation adaptations, such as increasing the crown of roads, adding swales in the right of way, and analyzing / improving bridge structures to withstand floodwinds.
All right, thanks, Evan. I think we're going to turn it over to Ken now. So Ken, would you introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. Ken Caban with Tetra Tech Civil and team. I'm a civil and environmental engineer and working on the power and water adaptation chapter. So the different types of infrastructure that we will evaluate will be wastewater treatment facilities, lift stations and pump stations, drinking water facilities, electric production and supply, stormwater infrastructure, and broadband networks. So some of the adaptation and mitigation strategies that we intend on using specifically for drinking water production are reverse osmosis and possible reuse, elevating electrical components on the water facilities, elevating and or flood proofing, so making some of the electrical components watertight, adding some pump stations and stormwater conveyance, and also some backflow facilities such as tidal check valves and things like that. And oops, something's blocking the screen there. Alternative energy, solar panels and things like that. Undergrounding of electrical and other infrastructure type lines, and then providing some electrical vehicle charging stations. So some of our possible goals for this project include increasing renewable energy, such as the solar panels shown here, converting some waste byproduct gas from old landfills to energy sources, reusing possible stormwater or wastewater, and then just general water efficiency, especially during emergency scenarios.
All right, thanks, Ken. I'm going to turn it over to Tim with Search.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're having a great day so far. I'm excited to talk about Key West historical and cultural resources. This is a really great opportunity to do some good for the citizens of Key West and to serve as an example to other vulnerable communities in the state and around the country. My name is Tim Parsons. I'm a senior project manager with Search. I also did a 10-year stint in the Florida Division of Historical Resources, where I served for about 7 of those years as a state historic preservation officer. So I have been on the flip side of a lot of these, working with and providing grant funding and that sort of thing to communities across the state, following hurricanes and addressing issues of climate change to develop these kinds of strategies. So I'm really excited to be part of this side of the universe and helping the city with their adaptation plan. One thing that we try to do and our goal with the culture and the historical and cultural chapter. And let me take one step back. I also have with me on the call Angelique Theriault, who is a principal investigator with Search and an architectural historian. So we're well represented in the different archaeological, architectural history and historical topics to address the different kinds of resources at Key West. So the things that we're looking at in the cultural and historical chapter are diverse. There are a lot of different resources and kinds of resources, classifications of resources in the city, ranging from historic districts, of course, like the Key West Historic District, the buildings within that historic district and other historical structures outside of the district. There are archaeological sites in Key West that are susceptible to sea level rise and storm effects. There are cemeteries, including National Register of Historic Places listed cemetery in the city of Key West that is extremely vulnerable. Other kinds of resources might include lighthouses, historic churches, and historic sites of industry, seaports, waterfronts, and that sort of thing. Key West is a unique place, and it's a really diverse place. And so there are certainly some interesting decisions and discussions to be had about what the priorities are going to be in regards to the different kinds of resources. Next slide, please. So there are a number of different kinds of adaptation strategies that can be applied to vulnerable historic properties, as I'm sure that anybody on this call and at the meeting who has experience with dealing with vulnerability issues with cultural resources knows. Generally speaking, there are protection strategies and accommodation strategies. Protection strategies are those that don't necessarily directly impact the building or structure. They could include things that have been discussed previously in this meeting, things like levees, flood walls, seawalls, revetments, and so on. There are soft adaptation strategies that are used in some places. I'm not suggesting these are necessarily appropriate for Key West, just throwing the ideas out there. Dunes were discussed, dune building, beach renourishment, living shorelines, that's been used in Pensacola with some level of effectiveness over the last decade or so in Pensacola Bay. There are accommodation strategies that more directly affect the structures. Of course, it's very controversial sometimes, especially with the National Park Service, who makes a lot of the rules for us to elevate historic structures, but that has been used effectively and is encouraged in some historic communities like historic Charleston, for example, which has some parallels to Key West. So elevation is an option. Wet floodproofing and dry floodproofing have already been discussed. So, everybody on the call is now familiar with those options. I won't go into too many details, but just again to mention historic Charleston, both of those options have been utilized there. Again, I have a lot of family in Pensacola, so I'm over there all the time and see this. There are a lot of wet floodproofing, a lot of wet flood-proofed structures in the Navy Point neighborhood, for example, and elsewhere in Pensacola that serve as good examples of what we're looking at with things like wet flood proofing and establishing sacrificial first floors, quote unquote, and that sort of thing. And then, of course, drainage and stormwater management improvements are something that is tied in with the infrastructure group that can be critically important in protecting historic structures. The things that we want to discuss in the chapter include all of these things, but also updating design guidelines, doing public education and educational approaches to make sure people know what their options are. Georgia, I think on the next slide, there are a few other things, including, some goals like updating park guidelines. I've already heard that there's a desire to focus on the historic district, which absolutely makes perfect sense. So that's something that we have considered as we've first going through the vulnerability assessment process and now moving into the adaptation plan. Revising zoning codes is something that's been zoning areas is something that has been done in other communities. And then, of course, elevating critical buildings, which again, it's always a controversial thing to talk about. But in some communities that's been enthusiastically adopted and it's been a good solution for them. I don't know that I included anything on these slides specifically about funding sources. As we all know, it can be very difficult to find funding sources for historic preservation projects. That's kind of a reality, although funding trickles in kind of from federal sources after disasters and when climate change and sea level rise is considered a priority for the Department of the Interior and other agencies. Grant funding is available from the state. Obviously, the Division of Historical Resources has a robust and historically well-funded grant program that can do some of these things, or at least contribute to doing some of these things. There are federal and state level historic preservation tax credits that can sometimes assist. And then, of course, there are traditional avenues like loans and so on, which have already been discussed. I think that's the end of my slide presentation. I'm excited to talk about this with everyone else. It's a challenge to do this sort of thing with cultural and historical resources. A lot of times cultural resources kind of get, I shouldn't say ignored, but sometimes they're not the #1 priority. A place like Key West where tourism and the historic district and historic neighborhoods are such an important and visible part of the community, it's possible that more can be done. So again, I'm excited to work with everybody and see where we go and end up with this. And I'm happy to answer any questions later on if anyone has them. Thanks a lot, Georgia.
Thanks, Tim. All right, next I will be turning it over to Tracy Leibel.
Hello, folks. I'm Tracy Leibold, a PhD marine ecologist with Tetra Tech. I've spent the better part of 30 years quietly working in the Florida Keys, starting with a lot of work for the National Marine Sanctuary. So I know that Key West is a data-rich environment for environmental information, and the vast majority is coastal and marine. But the residents and visitors spend most of their time on land, and the environment working group, the environment chapters, are going to focus on ecosystem attributes that people really care about. An important category of ecosystem services in Key West, and the Keys generally, are aesthetic services, trees, and the ecological attributes that create the vibe of jungle oases, walkable streets that was identified in the homework, clear fish-filled waters, the sensation of being connected to the ocean, are also environmental resources. These aesthetic crossovers have specific instances in examples like champion trees. Wetland and coastal and marine environmental resources are exceptionally well mapped in Key West, and your high-profile coastal and marine resources are really tightly tied into the aesthetic values of environmental resources. This is going to be much more than a simple listing of where are the wetlands and where are the mangroves. Next slide, Georgia, please. The environmental working group will begin with some strategies. What's shown on the slide here is not exhaustive and not necessarily even the highest priorities. But adaptation and mitigation strategies are tightly integrated with all of the other working groups, particularly with infrastructure and with equity. The idea of environmental aesthetics and the framing concept of critical ecology are prominent cross-cutting elements through any environment strategy. On the plus side, lots of other people are already working on these issues, and there's been a lot of progress to date throughout the Caribbean and worldwide in settings there have been successes from settings with far fewer resources than Key West. So in a setting like yours, a lot of goals are achievable. Mitigation strategies and adaptation can include general concepts like green infrastructure, increasing tree canopy, wetlands, sacrificial dunes, and intentionally soft shorelines, and then into the marine environment with coastal and seagrass and mangrove enhancement. Specifically, some tie-ins for funding sources will definitely have to focus on runoff and water quality and adjacent tie-ins with surrounding federal partners. Next slide, thanks. I'm gonna skip that idea. Because stormwater management is consistently a high priority item for Key West stakeholders, every environmental goal should assume that those infrastructure goals are already underway. So the environment is going to need to work tightly with the infrastructure group because their work is probably going to have a higher priority. A goal such as increased native tree canopy, first of all, of course, would need to far exceed anything desirable to account for future losses, again, because some projects, for example, with infrastructure are going to necessitate tree trimming and removal, and there's always going to be a bit of a balance. A small but quirky little goal with Key West can be tracking champion trees, and not just the existing champion trees, but tagging and identifying future trees and anticipating their graduation into the champion tree category. Again, environmental issues are going to cross-cut heavily with issues such as equity and human health. The generic goals to make more wetlands or improve wetlands has to be balanced against considerations for human health and vector-borne diseases. A wonderful environmental goal just cannot create wonderful mosquito habitats. There has to be an interesting crossover and balance. And one of the outcomes that I want everyone to to anticipate is that the coastlines, the literal coastlines and beaches of Key West are rather small, and their ecosystem function is relatively trivial. They are very high value for aesthetic and economic and equity issues. But there will be cases when the other working groups are highly focused on beaches, and the environmental working group says a version of, we don't really care very much, just go and do your thing. So in those respects, the outcomes of the environment working group are going to conspicuously not stand in the way of the goals of the other groups. And that is it for me.
All right, thanks, Tracy. Next, Valerie with Balmoral Group, and take it away.
Thanks, Georgia. So as Georgia said, I'm Valerie Seidel with the Balmoral Group. Lila Rachevskis is also online with me. We are firm and we have worked on economic adaptation strategies around the world. So we're excited to be working in the unique environment of Key West. And I'm really excited about the diverse working group here. The collective wisdom that has been assembled here will really help us to build an actionable and effective and realistic plan. So we're going to focus on understanding the current and future vulnerabilities of the island economy and ultimately recommend adaptation measures that will ensure resiliency of the existing businesses and the workforce. And when we talk about economic resilience, there's a couple of factors. We want to help businesses prepare for and withstand changing climate conditions and be able to respond and recover, when these risks actually occur. And it's often said that necessity is the mother of invention. And so as good American capitalists, we are going to look for ways to turn these challenges into opportunities. And that includes things like, taking some of the environmental adaptation or even infrastructure and green infrastructure opportunities and using those to build workforce, to build skills of tomorrow, to potentially build integrate with tourism. And I want to give a quick example. There's a site I've been to a number of times in Europe where there was a very famous jetty, and everyone had a picture of them with their family standing on the jetty and a t-shirt with the jetty. And at some point they realized climate conditions were such that the jetty was no longer tenable, and that's been turned into a big marsh area. Well, now you have people that go out there and they all take a picture in front of the marsh because it's pretty remarkable that they gave up, their jetty. And the point being, people are still going to want to go to Sloppy Joe's at night, but during the day, ultimately we may find a way to turn some of these adaptation strategies into something that also translates into tourism and educational opportunities. And that translates into workforce as well. So, if you go to Costa Rica, every third person you meet is an ecotourism guide, because that's what they have. They have ecotourism. If you go to Charleston, you meet a lot of crafts people who restore historic homes, because they have a lot of historic homes. And as we identify these restoration and retrofit and adaptation strategies, we want to be thinking about those workforce implications and what that means in terms of building new sources of tourism revenue, identifying ways to deal with substandard buildings and those sorts of things, and diversification around that. So, we will be looking at this, across the issues that are listed here. Certainly, we know that there are opportunities within each of these categories as well as with others, and really coming to this with an open mind of, how do you make lemonade from the lemons that you have? And how do you optimize the resources that you have to really benefit local businesses and help them be in a position to recover quickly when they're, when damages occur, but also adapt to evolving conditions and what that means for market factors and, and all of those other asset implications. If you can go to the next slide, Georgia. So some of the goals that were brought forward already included things like smart city implementation and, really using new technology capabilities to collect real-time data to, to allow the city to act on and proactively manage infrastructure, for example, which in itself, begets a whole another supply chain round of people able to, manage and install and all of those things. And then looking at how to harness existing structures that are maybe somewhat dated or could be more optimized going forward to redeploy for new uses. So there are a lot of avenues to go with the different choices that will face Key West businesses, and how those will interact with infrastructure decisions and environmental decisions and all the things we've already talked about. There is a list of data needs that have already been, put together, and we'll be following up and chasing down some of that with this group. But we really look forward to working with our working group and learning everything we can to make sure that what we bring forward is actionable and effective for everyone.
All right, thanks, Valerie. I'm going to turn it over to Vicki, and you have 2 chapters. She's very lucky. She gets to work on 2 chapter working groups. So thanks, Vicki, and I also look forward to your description and discussion on equity and how that will be implemented across all chapters.
Super. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Georgia. I guess it is still morning. Yeah, so for housing, sorry, my name is Vicki Boguszewski. I am with Tetra Tech. I have been with Tetra Tech about 3 years and work in a number of different capacities, including participating in adaptation planning. I have lived in Key West for 28 years and served for quite some time as a representative on the county's Climate Advisory Committee. I have a master's in public health and also have a background in arts and public health. How do we use arts and artistic methods to improve our public health and secure good, healthy conditions within communities for all populations? So, of course, in a community like ours, in a community like Key West, creativity is a capacity. Artists are a force in and of themselves. And so we have a lot to draw on in terms of creating positive adaptations and solutions to the various issues that we're identifying through both the vulnerability assessment and the ongoing adaptation plan. So in terms of housing and shelter, we all know that affordable housing is a major issue here in our community. Some of the things that we can consider related to that, special purpose vouchers, those relate to different populations and different types of housing. There are a number of opportunities through the Office of Housing and Urban Development to have voucher programs. There also are low-income housing tax credits. We do use those. There are a few properties in Key West that receive those now, and that's where a homeowner is receiving a tax credit because they are renting their property to low-income persons. We also have, of course, workforce housing in Key West that can be expanded. We'll focus on some of the insurance issues related to pre-firm residential structures. FIRM, of course, is an organization within the community that supports homeowners being able to manage insurance premiums and keeping those affordable for our residents. Dealing with issues of severe repetitive loss as relates to sea level rise. We may consider voluntary buyout programs in addition to some of our flood proofing and other ways of addressing that concern of sea level rise and its ongoing impacts. First floor elevations, similar issue there, and forgivable loans is one option for addressing those. Temporary shelters and transitioning, we do, of course, have our COTS shelter. Making that more resilient as we go forward may be something that our group works on. Creating community resilience hubs. These can address things like business continuity after an event. They can be meeting places, they can be planning hubs, they can mean whatever they need to mean for the particular community where they are implemented. And there are a number of federal funding resources to develop those. Next slide, please, Georgia. Again, goals to be set for these chapter or the housing and shelter chapter to increase affordable housing by 25% by 2050. Increase our shelter in place options. We, of course, will be focused, some of the other chapters will be focusing on evacuation routes. What types of shelters do we have in our community that can be utilized now as in-place shelters? And what do we have that we might be able to retrofit or change going forward to serve as an in-place shelter opportunity for future events? Next slide, please. Equity, as Georgia mentioned, will be a consideration of all of our chapters. It's really an approach to the plan rather than a chapter of its own. But within our health and equity chapter, we'll focus on some of the climate and health literacy issues, increasing educational opportunities through health and human services. We'll be looking at environmental exposures, not only within homes and buildings, but around homes and buildings, or homes and shelters, as well as in the community in general. Exposures to heat, standing water, these types of things. What can we do to promote reduction of those exposures, as well as educate people to understand how to address those exposures? Communication being a big factor in social health as well as health in general. If people do not understand the issues, they're not going to care about them. So health literacy is a big part of that type of communication. Also including sign language interpreters or multilingual communications, maybe more Braille signage, or for example, in parks, maybe having picture boards, which are a type of communication used by autistic adults to make those areas more user-friendly. ADA compliance is a big part of active living, and our city does a great job on that. We have some beautiful fitness trails and opportunities for accessing the great outdoors, so to speak, but we can always improve that, and we'll be taking a look at opportunities to do that through this chapter. For anyone who knows me, you know that healthy eating and community gardening is a very big value for me. So I'd love to see what can we do about edible communities or edible landscaping and campuses here within our own community. How do we improve our access to clean drinking water? Do we need more desalination opportunities? We have one plant, and what will we want to see from that in the future? Same with our cistern program. Allison has a great program that gives homeowners points for having cisterns on their properties. How can we utilize that to build resilience within the community? Our next slide, please. So some of our goals, of course, will be to maybe reduce health disparities. That's one way we can improve equity across the board, is to increase access to health information and provide additional wellness opportunities. Oftentimes, the city may partner with other entities and organizations to present wellness opportunities. We want our actions that come out of these chapters on health and equity. We know that the city is not the health department, but the city does have opportunity to partner with lots of different organizations and to present opportunities for health and equity to be presented to our community members. I think that kind of wraps it up for me. I don't think there's a next slide. Is there, Georgia? Thank you. I guess that doesn't wrap it up for me.
Yep, this is still you. Thanks, Vicki. It's still you.
Yeah, certainly. So we can just go to the next slide on that one, if you don't mind. As equity in all chapters and equity as an approach to our plan is really, I don't think I need to say more than that. It's an approach. It's not something that's separate. So I really encourage everyone to think about who the work you're doing benefits and who does it leave out? And if it's leaving someone out, is there a way that it can be modified to be more inclusive? And if there's any question about ways to do that, I'm happy to be a part of any other chapter that needs some guidance on that and brainstorming, or to share more resources and ideas. So yeah, so as we do our work, we want to make sure that the benefits are distributed fairly. We don't want to create an adaptation that benefits one group and harms another. That's not the purpose of our plan. And that's not a goal of the city. Of course, equity, taking into account that there are varying capacities. The capacity of Key West to be resilient is demonstrated on a daily basis, and we've had our 200-year anniversary in recent years. Our communities bounce back, and one of the reasons that happens is because we do things together, and we have an approach already within this community to reach across the fence and share with the neighbor. Our motto of one human family should be an important part of every part of this plan. As we seek to address historical injustices and socioeconomic disparities within the community, the way that we'll do that is by creating new opportunities. It's not a focus on the past. We have a historic and cultural chapter that will focus on our history and highlight what our story has been. And that story should be inclusive of all the groups that have been a part of it. Some groups have benefited, others have not, but everyone should be a part of the story that we tell. So as we're telling that story, it will be important to remember that there is always another side, and to try to demonstrate all aspects of the story that we tell. Next slide, please. So these are some terms to consider for persons who have not really spent a lot of time thinking about equity or vulnerability. We're talking about vulnerability. We often identify community groups. So for example, persons who are older, persons who are very young, are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and particularly the health impacts of climate change. Extreme heat, for example, is very taxing on older persons and very taxing on the very young. Their immune systems are not primed, so to speak, for responding and addressing extreme conditions. So that's just one example of the types of communities that we might consider as we're addressing equity throughout our various strategies and plans. Inclusive planning, I think I've kind of touched on that. I don't want to, over drill anything, but again, just remembering there's always two sides, and will the work that we do benefit everyone? Will it benefit some more than others? And how can we equalize those benefits? Resource allocation, making sure that everyone has access to the resources. We are a public entity. The city is a public entity using public funding in most cases. And so those funds should be accessible, and the resources and benefits that they generate accessible to everyone. As we build capacity, we are providing training, providing workforce training, but also community-based education to inform persons of risk as well as opportunities for addressing risk. Next slide, please. I do want to say that in that capacity building, we do find that social cohesion, connecting people, connecting groups with one another is a big way to build capacity. So that's an important element that we can focus on through adaptation. Policy. Do you have someone else that you want to speak on policy and governance, or should I continue?
That's still you. I have Erin Dede is going to focus on policy after you finish up with this slide.
Okay, thank you so much. So again, equitable adaptation is what we're looking for. One really great example of equity is to say that if everyone needs shoes, you can't give everyone a size 7 and think that you've met the need. So you need to give people the size shoe that will fit them. That's how we, a sort of simple way to think about equity. It's not about things being equal. It's about creating equal access. So, that in that same example, it's if everyone needs shoes, it's not to say that they all need the same size shoe. They need the one that fits them and will help them to walk the mile with you. So as we look at policy and governance throughout this chapter, I think that's really what we need to keep in mind, is that we are addressing specific concerns in specific neighborhoods for specific populations in everything that we do. That vulnerability assessment is really detailed. It's at the GIS level, so that kind of information is available to us. I know that's a lot to think about, But again, as Key Westers, that's how we do it, right? We do it together. We get through it together. So I think that's it for me, actually. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them or to try to. Thank you all for your time.
Thanks, Vicki. I am going to turn it over to Aaron Dede now to talk about policy and integration into existing plans and how we're going to make all these projects and prioritize work for the city.
So this isn't really a standalone chapter. This is going to be a cross-cutting effort across all of the chapters, because when you all within the individual areas come up with various strategies and priorities, we need to kind of do a spot check with the comprehensive plan and the code to make sure that the ideas that you all are generating can actually be implemented in the way that you are anticipating. For instance, a strategy may be that we need more on-site retention for residential and commercial development, and that may not be the design standard within your code of ordinances right now. We may need to change the level of service in terms of providing stormwater management. Areas that are more tidally influenced are not going to be able to perform from a stormwater management perspective the same way areas that are further inland, and there are different flooding impacts influencing those areas. So we might want to expand and modify potentially the level of service standards that we have both within the comprehensive plan and the code. So examples of these really come down to, instead of thinking of just recovery zones, the better linkage between disaster management, resilience planning, and floodplain management. A lot of times when local governments have various sections of their code, they're not always integrated and talking about those concepts together. Certain capital projects that may bubble up may translate over and be good additions to the next update of the local mitigation strategy, which is happening within the next 3 to 4 years, but those discussions start now in terms of project priorities. The use of adaptation action areas, or even more importantly, environmentally constrained areas where maybe we are not going to focus our adaptation efforts, and we're going to do the best we can in those particular areas, but due to the fact that they have environmental constraints, that may not be a priority area where we are investing adaptation policies and dollars. And again, there has been mention of voluntary buyouts. The question is, what do you do with the land once it has been purchased? And what policies and code provisions do we have in effect that may prohibit or limit the reuse of those areas to something that's more effective, that helps us manage flooding and manage for more resilience? So, no good deed goes unpunished. When you acquire a property, you may not be able to, for instance, cite a stormwater management structure there or a pump, and that may be necessary as part of the plan to better manage water in that area after the buyout has occurred. So all of these things are really important in thinking about them in the context of what the city has within its comprehensive plan and code. So we will do scans for those high priority strategies and those high priority projects to make sure that we don't have hit that law of unintended consequences where we have something existing within the comprehensive plan and the code that may prevent us from implementing that. And it's obviously better to know that sooner rather than later, so people don't gravitate around that one strategy and say, this is it, this is the one that's highest for our issue area. And then we realize that it takes a lot to potentially implement that through the comprehensive plan and the code or other policy initiatives. So really, this is kind of cross-cutting to make sure that the priorities and the projects and the things that fall out as the highest and most consensus-based approaches can actually be implemented, and that we can do that as easily and as pain-free as possible.
Thanks so much, Erin. I know that you are a wealth of information on the policy side, and so are a great addition to this team, and working with all the other chapters to ensure that the projects we identify are implementable. So that concludes our formal presentation today. So I wanted to just take an opportunity to ask if anyone in the audience, either in the meeting room or online, has any questions or comments. I do see a chat here. I'm not sure if it's a not seeing anything.
Is there anybody in the room that would like to say anything or has a question? I can
Any
either
comments?
repeat or you can come up front.
Yeah, any thoughts you had while we were reviewing the chapters about goals that we maybe need to add to our very preliminary list, or projects that come to mind or came to mind during our presentation that you think should be included in our chapters? Anything we're missing?
Go ahead, Anna.
Different chapters, but some things that were done recently, ongoing projects right now. Probably again span across several different chapters, but how are we tracking whether or not, or what effect those have had in the areas, what they were in place for? I mean, I know we have the plans and the meetings and we're going through it now, but things that are already in place or that were already put into action, or maybe that are coming up that were done before this group got together. How are we going to do that look back to see if it actually made a difference and improved upon, or should we celebrate the fact that, that it's helping?
That's a really good question. The one thing I will say, and we didn't get a chance to, really kind of go into the successes thus far of the city, but I've got a slide of a postcard from like 1860s of Green Street underwater, and it's like high tide in Key West. I was like, why did we make this a postcard? Why are we sending this out to anybody? But we've been dealing with sea level rise for a long time. We just and we've always found whatever's the lowest part and we take care of that, and then the next lowest part, the next lowest part. The problem was, for a very long time we were only designing the fix to a fixed place. Our utilities engineer that just left us for California overhauled our stormwater master plan, which is actually my favorite document here. It sounds really horribly wonky, but it is the really up until about time with the adaptation plan, the only real long-term document we had, because it was a 10-year plan that got updated every 5 years. So they were always thinking about, what are we doing for the next 10 years according to what are the needs out there right now. So when he took that over, it had already been revamped twice. So they were on the 10th year, and now we've got another 10. When he was taking that over and they were redoing, they said, let's look at these guidelines. And they are doing all of their future conditions to a place that's kind of middle ground predictions. And if you dig into our vulnerability report, there's this prediction, there's this prediction, like nothing much happens, a lot happens, and they kind of went for in between, which is what's recommended for local governments when you're looking at the 50-year mark. So when they design those, they're already, looking at what the effects will be when they design it. And that's anything that we've had hit the books in the last 3 to 5 years. Besides the things that we have done that were at least to, a bit higher. from everything here on out, we will have these newer design standards, which is great. And that really, comes down to more of that roads and drainage type of things. And then, just our own code, state of Florida says when you build, it's, base flood elevation +1. Our BPAS says 1.5. So we've got all of these, and it'll be good to have kind of one place that also, acts as a compendium of sorts of what we do have, and then where we're going to build off from there. Did that answer your question?
That we'll have access. I mean,
Yes.
we can draw on that. We can say,
Absolutely. And I think that's going to be a key part of some of these, as we dig into our chapters. And this is going to come from you guys. What do we know? When we talk about, data trends, we've got the federal data, but what has changed in the social realm? How has the people who have needed you changed over time? What do we expect? Is it more families? Is it more singles? Is it, what is that? So those kind of local data or trends are kind of important that we need to start with as our baseline, and that, everybody can share with each other.
And Allison, just so you know, we can't hear the audience participants unless they speak into a microphone. So
I didn't repeat that very well. I meant to.
Okay.
Rod, why don't you go ahead and come on up?
Hi, Rod Delastrinos, Director of Transportation, City of Key West. And it's a little weird looking into the audience rather than reporting to the commission. And this is kind of just like Anna had said about, it's across the different disciplines. One of the things that, and this is kind of more toward the power side of the house, and I see that there was a lot of talk about the hardening of the different utilities. From my perspective, and having transportation, we're looking at what are the next 5 years, what are the next 10 years as far as transportation and the type of conveyances that we have in the community. And one of the requirements, like we're probably a year out from our first electric battery bus. I don't think that's going to make much of an impact, but I think as we transition more and more, even in the community, to electric, does the current utility, can that meet that type of, expansion and that use of the utility? Because probably for private conveyances, but like for bus, that's one of our main concerns. So much so is that we are required to submit to the FTA, Federal Transit Administration, a zero emissions fleet transition plan when we're asking for these federal dollars. And it's good because actually here it's more like, it's not, I think in Orlando it's like, oh, we want electric buses. Great. We will buy them in 5 years. Some of the things that we have to consider are, and this is another cross thing with evacuation. Do you really want to be sitting in an electric bus, for whatever 4 or 5 hours, and maybe we run out of power somewhere around Alamorada? You can't fill up that, those type of considerations. And again, the impact. One of the things, because we have hybrid buses, and one of them we're replacing a battery pack, very expensive. But then what do you do with all those batteries? Because that's an environmental consideration. We don't want to be bringing that type of, that waste to our community. And so, what's the process? So I think as we go into the adaptation and all the Key West technology that's coming out, I think it's worth a look to consider, what tomorrow will look like. And then, there's a lot of great information. I appreciate that. But I think, at least from my wheelhouse, I'm looking at, should we buy all these things, and does it have a negative impact on the community? That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Rod. Any other questions from the room? Go ahead and I'll repeat. I'm going to make that a shorter question. Two key questions is how are we working with the county and other partners for these areas that are not ours. One of the example being the Key West International Airport. And now I just blanked on the second one. Oh, and that hospitals and schools were not heard of. There's two different pieces there. Hospitals and schools were called out in the original vulnerability report. Some of them will fall under infrastructure and those pieces. Some might fall under roads because they are specifically, we need to make sure we get to them. So those will not be forgotten. The other question, the county has a number of slots on our working groups. They are also part of our steering committee that has overseen the whole process. But the base question that I want to address that is on my notes is we will be talking about things that aren't the cities. Our vulnerability assessment, calls out, water stuff, power stuff. We don't do water and power. But the key thing is for a number of reasons is we got a grant that'll help us look at these things. And if we can help everybody else look at these things together, it's going to get us to a much better place. And another key thing, if we've got a product that calls out what you need, you're more apt to get funding for it. And we can help find you funding for it. So we want to make sure that everybody's as integrated as possible. Can we say you have to do this? No, but hopefully the case is built, especially through the prioritization project of what things need to, take the front and which ones might need to take a back seat. Any other questions? Go ahead from the back. That was a very good question. Do we have an example of an example city that's done this? Ish. So like Miami Beach has done a great historical piece. Some areas have done great environmental pieces. So one of the things I tried to put in that homework is some of these examples. Please, if you know of any others or come across any others, we might try to do some sort of a Dropbox or somewhere where you can, add things as you find them, or just send them to us and we'll put them in a shared place. But yes, there are, the good news about being a little late to the game is that we're not inventing the wheel in most cases. And so we want to see how these things worked in other areas and then, be able to tweak them for our needs. So there are very good examples across all of the working group chapters. I really want to thank everybody for slogging through all the chapters with us. Yes, we have a good question. Yes. Me. So this actually came from the very, very beginning when I was researching about 30 other plans to write for the grant to do the project. And since we haven't sat down with any other groups yet to tweak on that, it was put in our RFQ as potential things to talk about, but is not considered the be all end all, nor, are we limited to that? Very good question though. I didn't repeat that question. Did everybody understand from my answer what the question was with a nod of heads? The question was, where did the primer come from? So the that initial part of the homework that I sent around, it came from very early work in studying other adaptation plans were out there to make sure how these other ideas applied to Key West and the Keys. And but we hope to really change them now that we have more people at the table. Question from Anna.
Okay, so as everything's as we're each in our groups working on it, is there going to be like a main hub like our the things sent out to us that we can go into it
Yes.
and see what transportation is doing, or see what another part of the planning.
We can figure that out. I hadn't thought of that yet, but yeah.
There might be something that they're working on that, you know, would benefit us on what we're working on, or vice versa.
Yeah, and the other key thing, we've got a member from our planning department on every single working group, as well as a couple of us that oversee kind of all of them. So if we do specifically say, hey, this also would help them, we'll try to put it in both. But yeah, I like the idea of being able to peruse, because you might have an interest in more than one thing, and being able to have access to that. If you've got the time, I would love it. Absolutely. I didn't repeat the question.
You know, that could affect us in the long run.
The question that I did not repeat was, might we have a place to drag and drop all of this stuff, and can other groups see other groups work? And I think that is a very good idea. We will try to make happen.
Allison,
That's
we do
great.
have-
So yeah, the question was, how are we going to set up the next meetings? Did you want to address that, Georgia, or you want me to go ahead?
Sure. First we need to schedule the next meeting. You know, we really want to get some goals on paper, some prioritized projects, and some more data collected, really. So some of the plans that were mentioned today, we need to, you know, bring into our circle of information, and then we can start working to develop the goals and the projects. I know Carly's on the call, and she can probably remind me when we targeted the next working group meeting. I think it's probably September-ish.
I think we were looking at September.
And then there are also a couple of hands raised on
yes, but it'll be mostly just online, so whoever from wherever. Yeah, there'll be individual meetings, as well as towards the end, kind of a grouped up. We will be. So yeah, so I will send, you'll either get emails from me or calendar invites from Carly Clapper. She's our Tetra Tech person, so when you see that, it's not spam, go ahead and say yes. We learned to do that because I found that if I forwarded a meeting, it didn't, all that information wasn't kept in one place. So that way, if I want to send an email to everybody, if we've added a couple on along the way, not everybody would get it. So you'll get information from either I or Carly Clapper. The next thing you'll be getting, I'm going to send you guys the working group list. I really, if you haven't had a chance to do the homework yet, now that we've got your creative juices flowing, now that you've slogged through all 7 different chapters and see where they overlap and where they might not, and any junctions that you see, I think it'd be very helpful to just get some ideas out on paper early, especially if any other great resources you've come across. We will be also working on a survey to be sent out to the public that will delve deeper into those 7 things. So once we've come up with this and you guys got a chance to, you know, add a question or tweak a question, we'd like you to send it out to any groups that you have so that we can get a wider set of info from everybody. Our next steps here, the vulnerability assessment that you heard about will be presented to the City Commission on August 8th. So you can watch that later when it's posted. And yeah, we'll be asking you for dates for that next meeting. And we got a raised hand online.
Valerie, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks. So this is Valerie from the Economic Working Group. And so I just wanted to put out there for anyone that's interested, I'm going to be in Key West next Thursday. I'm actually there next Thursday and Friday, but next Thursday at 8:30 a.m. if there's anyone from my working group or, or otherwise that would like to talk about economics in the context of this adaptation plan. I'll put out an invite, but I will be at the Harvey Government Center on Truman, and would be happy to meet with anyone in person that's available. Thank you.
Thanks, Valerie. Kelly, did I see your hand up and did it go down?
You did, and I apologize, but I had to jump off for a few minutes for a work call, so this may have been answered, and it also just may be my ignorance on the process. But Evan brought up a lot of elevating roadways and roadways that included federal and state roadways, and I'm just not understanding how that becomes part of our project with the city.
So we recognize that the city may not have ownership or have control over some of these infrastructure, pieces of infrastructure, roads, and even some buildings. But we want to include, if it's something that rises to a priority to be included in the plan, this plan gives us an opportunity to start having conversations with those entities, so they can acknowledge the importance of potential improvements or adaptation strategies for those
Thank you.
pieces of infrastructure.
And I'll give an example. Long before this whole thing kicked off, we've been telling the county for 2 years that we want to work on where Eaton goes past the Navy base, and the Navy's been telling them that as well. So they went through their own roads vulnerability assessment, and they had a couple things that were higher than that. They are working on a grant for Flagler right now, but they do know that it's important to us. And we're willing to meet them, with the design and other pieces that might also cost money on our side. We have a question?
That's one of the things, or one of the reasons that I was asking you about how things were going to proceed. If we need to look back at what was already there, what was already being done. Specifically on my road, I live on First Street. They just did the county came through. I did not understand that was a county project until I started asking questions. I mean, and I lived there. I got the announcements and whatever. It just didn't dawn on me. It didn't equate to, hey, it's not the city doing it. But if we didn't have that, if they hadn't made those improvements, then we wouldn't have. We'd be flooding. The residents would be, having more issues later, and it does affect us. It is the county's responsibility. The county owns and runs the road. However, if the county doesn't know it's important to the city, then it doesn't get done, and the residents is who suffers.
Absolutely. The point was made about a project that has recently happened, or short recently, out on First Street, that many people might not have known that was a county project and county property, and that it needed to be done. The good news is that the head of engineering for the county lives here in town. So she does know those things. But yes, and that's why they are absolutely part of this process. Yep. I answered back to Commissioner Carey, and yes, I did see something on the.
I see Evan Haskell has his hand up.
Got it. Evan, do you want to go ahead and just ask?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And let me know if this is too specific for today's meeting, but it was just a question for infrastructure and environment as well. I've seen in other cities, places that use living or green stormwater management, to put it simply, basically a garden where stormwater drains might be. In Key West, we have a lot of challenges with that kind of concept due to the high tides kind of backflowing through the stormwater drains. So I was just wondering if it's ever been seen where salt tolerant plants can be put into a stormwater management system in a way that could possibly help with street flooding and also to filter watershed pollution as it heads out to our roadways?
I think that's a really good question. So the key thing is it depends. So there are going to be some areas, like you said, that are already too low, where providing that as a runover doesn't help when it's a high tide and a lot of rain. There will be some areas kind of in that mid ground. For the beauty about some road work is that sometimes when you are redoing the right-of-way side of the road, you're revisiting that about every 20 years. So when you're working on that, you can, certain roads that are appropriate, we can add that, and we want to, and it will last until it doesn't. So we can at least do that from the zones that are a certain height and up. And it also means that we need to be thinking right now on those lower zones when we are planting trees, regardless of, the stormwater areas, about what we're putting in the first place. If that tree is going to live at least 40, 50, 60 years, what is that condition going to be for it, at that stage? And where the roots go. Yeah, and actually that's a really cool thing. We tried to do it on United, but people wanted their parking spaces. There's some other cities where they do what are called tree cells, and it makes a space. It looks the same as all of our other sidewalk trees around, where you've only got that much space on top, but you've actually created and dug out space underneath that sidewalk for the roots to spread out, so they don't get boxed in, because we don't have soil, so they don't end up like as if they're inside a large pot. Did I answer your question, Evan?
Yes. I would love to discuss more on that topic at a future time. Don't need to soak up everybody's time today.
Super, thank you.
Allison, this is Lisette Carey.
Yes.
I'm having trouble raising my virtual hand, so here's my real one. Just to comment on what Evan just asked about, could we possibly utilize a couple of the pocket parks on Flagler in connection with that suggestion? Like when he's talking about the sea level rise on Flagler, I realize it's related to high tide, but we have a few parks that maybe we could.
There's been a lot of good examples of parks being reinvented to live with water. We've got a pretty good example at the backside of Indigenous Park. Sometimes, it's a wetlands that fills and drains from the neighborhood near it. That's absolutely an idea. Another one that's been put out there is throughout Newtown, we have a lot of alleyways that might be a good gathering space for water to go to. And also when there are, I don't know that we've done any, I don't know if the county has done any voluntary buyouts yet. There was a number of people who had applied. I'm not sure if any of them went all the way to fruition, but those areas, when the federal government buys them out, cannot be built on again, but they can help with, they could become their own little pocket park to deal with overflow. Absolutely.
Hey, Allison, this is Vicki. I just want to back you up on what you're saying there. The county completed 21 buyouts since 2021. Those are they use federal funding, and the funding is provided with the stipulation that the properties be placed under what's called a restrictive covenant. And that restrictive covenant allows the building rights to be removed. So in our community, that's ROGO, right? We take the ROGO off of that parcel. It gets placed into a pool that the county can use at a future date. And then the parcel is restricted to green space or stormwater management. The only types of facilities the only type of construction that can occur on those parcels would be a restroom associated with the green space use, parking for green space use, or stormwater management infrastructure.
That's good to know. I didn't know about the stormwater infrastructure piece. Go ahead, question from the room.
Green space and the stormwater, could that not be
Yes, it could be both. So you could have, yeah, you could have the public park that is most of that property, but still that important pump, yeah, and then pump station that takes care of the street. For Mrs. Tiffany. That's right. That's right. The question was, this was specific to the health and equity section, but it also kind of applies on the grand scale is, do we already have access to some of that equity data that's out there and the severe repetitive loss that's out there? I'm 99% sure that we've already got that. But a key thing now, especially, now that you've kind of been part of this kickoff, go back and look at one of those homework documents I sent. That is the list of everything we've used, we have available to us and went into our vulnerability assessment. I'm 99% that it's there, but if there's something you know of and it's not there, that's what we need to know. Yeah. I think that'd be great, just in case. I know that, yeah, there's the census side, but what does the FEMA data have, and how far can we drill down? And that would be good to have. That's fantastic. I think that's great. So that was a comment from Tiffany Pelliser that's with United Way. And she was saying that there was an Hurricane Ian after action report statement that did go into some of these pieces, and she has sent that to me, so I'll make sure it gets into the Dropbox, and we'll get that out to everybody. Any other questions from the room or we are getting 10 minutes to time. Want to see if I had one last thing I wanted to say. I have one. It wasn't on any of the information I sent out, but I want to make sure, not only are you here to help the entire community, I want to help you. So there actually is on the city's website, it's hard to find, but if you go to, when the little drop down comes down, it's got departments and management, there's community, and in there's resilience. Under there is a section that is for businesses, which is still getting fleshed out a little bit more, but there's a section for residents. There is the elevation program that the funding comes around every September, October. There's information about that. The county helps us out extraordinarily by taking care of every single applicant across the Florida Keys. Mike Lalbachon is very, very helpful. You need a elevation certificate and a budget. Firm's website has a lot of information about what the city cannot tell you what contractors to use, but Firm's website has a list of those who have done these jobs here in the Keys. There are a couple different options. Read through there. There is a link to a Florida program, which is called My Safe Florida Home. They will come out and do a free inspection of your property and tell you what you need to do and how much you might be able to save by doing it. There is money for actually doing some jobs afterwards. If you meet certain income levels, they've run out the money for this year for the state because it's very popular, but at least you can get that first survey and be in the door. And there's some info about a program that is still coming. We don't know when it'll be unveiled. The FEMA program is national and competitive. We put in for a couple of years and got nothing. And it wasn't until 2 years ago that we learned that they've picked up the project, and that's all we've heard for 2 years. But the Army Corps did a study that has a link. It's the Florida Keys Coastal Risk Study. They identified 5 places on US 1 that needed some shoring up. Those are what's being designed right now. The next on their list was some 90 critical infrastructure pieces. Again, this is countywide, of which I think there was 10 or 11 in Key West. Some of this are schools, some of these are our own buildings. When that funding comes available, now that they're named on the report, when the funding comes available, the match is only 35% local. And the last most important piece is they also recognized commercial buildings and residential buildings. I'm still trying to get them to give me the map so that you can look up your property. But again, when that project comes along, it will not be nationally competitive. It'll be local. It'll be around for 10 years. So you've got time to save up what you need. My battery's running low. So there is my thank you for coming out, and hope I can help you. Thank you guys very much, both online and in the room. Again, take the survey, watch for our emails so we can schedule you for the next meeting in September, and we'll go from there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks, Georgia.
Thank you all. I know those chairs aren't the most comfortable thing. What you got? I know. That's what reason why we have this, but yes. Yeah, or we just added a couple more things to your folder. I agree.
You know, like numbers. You
Hello. Rick was on our list, but he never responded back.
I'm saying.
No, but the beauty is not go back to Rick and be like, hey, 3 other people said you should be here.
I told her. He's not gonna listen to this. Nice to meet you. I'm sorry. So that's.
Okay.
So I will just.
I do, so we have firewall issues, so I'm like, okay, yeah, I've got personal email, like work, Google email. And then you come up with that, like, where did I say that? But good, I appreciate that. Thank you for coming. Need help with your job?